The
Did you
smoke
hear the
rose from the
wind
hillside every
howl?
morning.
Yes,
Thin and
but it's
gray
so
against the winter
cozy in here.
sky, it climbed
Another
upward
cup of
like a
warming
prayer that
soup?
refused to die. It appeared at the same hour each day just after dawn, when the frost still clung to the dead grass and the wind carried the smell of snow yet to fall. There was no cabin on that hillside, no soddy, no dugout that anyone could see. Just smoke rising from the frozen earth like the breath of something buried alive. Alderman Cornelius Whitmore had searched that hillside 3 times. He was a man who did not accept mysteries, a man who believed that everything in Havenwood existed under his authority, including the land and including the people, including the smoke that defied his understanding. He had walked every inch of that slope with 12 men behind him, their horses snorting clouds of vapor into the December air. They had looked for the structure that had to be there, looked for the girl who had to be hiding somewhere. They had found nothing. Nothing but snow and dead grass and that thin wisp of smoke that seemed to come from nowhere at all. On the third search, Whitmore had stood at the highest point of the hillside, his boots planted firmly on the frozen ground. He had looked down at the valley where Havenwood huddled against the cold, its buildings small and fragile from this distance. The smoke rose not 20 feet from where he stood. He could smell it. Wood smoke. The kind that comes from a stove burning low and steady through the night. The kind that speaks of warmth and shelter and someone tending the fire. But there was nothing beneath his feet except earth. Hard, frozen, unbroken earth. "The girl is dead," he announced to the town council that December evening. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Froze out there somewhere. The smoke must be some kind of natural phenomenon. Gas escaping from the ground. The girl is gone." The council members nodded. They had no reason to doubt him. Cornelius Whitmore was not a man who admitted uncertainty, and the people of Havenwood had learned long ago that questioning him brought nothing but trouble. The matter was settled. The Lindahl girl had died on the prairie, just as everyone had predicted she would, when she walked away from her father's homestead with nothing but the clothes on her back. It was a tragedy, they said. It was also, they said, exactly what happened when a young woman refused to know her place. But 15 feet below Alderman Whitmore's boots, at the very moment he declared her dead, Sina Lindahl lay in her bed, listening to his footsteps on her roof. She was 17 years old. She was warm, she was fed, she was alive, and she smiled in the darkness of her underground home as the most powerful man in Havenwood walked away, convinced of her death. Let him believe it, she thought. Let them all believe it. The dead do not threaten the living. The dead do not remind people of their cruelty. The dead simply disappear, and the living go on with their lives, telling themselves that what happened was inevitable, that nothing could have been done. Sina Lindahl had learned a great many things in the 3 months since her father died. She had learned how to cut sod blocks that would hold together. She had learned how to angle an entrance so water would drain away. She had learned how to build a chimney so thin it looked like nothing more than a stick poking out of the ground. But the most important thing she had learned was this: sometimes the best way to survive was to let people believe you were already gone. The smoke rose from the hillside every morning, and Sina Lindahl, the girl who had vanished, kept her fire burning. She had not always been a ghost. 6 months before the smoke and the searches and the underground home, Sina Lindahl had been a farmer's daughter with a future as solid as the Dakota earth. Her father, Torsten Lindahl, who had brought her to America when she was 6 years old. They had sailed from Norway in the spring of 1875, leaving behind a country that could not feed them for a land that promised everything to those willing to work for it. Torsten was a man built for hard work. His hands were rough as oak bark, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a plow, his heart large enough to hold all the love he had never been able to give his wife, who had died bringing Sina into the world. For 11 years they had built their life together on the Dakota prairie. Torsten had claimed 160 acres of grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. He had built a soddy with his own hands, cutting blocks of earth from the ground and stacking them into walls that would withstand the winter winds. He had broken the prairie with a plow pulled by oxen he had purchased with money saved from 3 years of working other men's farms. And through it all, he had raised his daughter, not as a delicate thing to be protected from the world, but as a partner in the endless work of survival. Sina learned to ride before she learned to read. She learned to shoot before she learned to cook. She learned to read the weather in the movement of clouds, to predict storms by the behavior of cattle, to find water in land that seemed as dry as bone. Her father taught her everything he knew. The land does not lie, Torsten told her one evening when she was 12 years old. They sat on the porch of the soddy, watching the sun sink into the prairie like a burning coin dropped into a sea of grass. People lie, he said. People make promises they do not keep. People smile while they plan your destruction. But the land tells you the truth. It shows you what it is. It gives you what you earn, nothing more, nothing less. Sina never forgot those words. In the years that followed, she came to understand their meaning more deeply than her father could have imagined. The summer of 1886 was good to the Lindahl farm. The rains came when they were needed. The wheat grew tall and golden. The cattle grew fat on grass that seemed to spring from the earth overnight. Torsten, now 53 years old, began to speak of the future in ways he never had before. When I am gone, he told Sina one August evening, as they walked the fields together, this will all be yours. Every acre, every blade of grass, every stone. He paused, looking out at the land that had consumed his youth and given him in return a life of hard-won dignity. I want you to find a good man, he said, a man who will work beside you, not above you, a man who understands that this land is yours, not his, a man who will give you children to carry on what we have built. Signa smiled at her father. She was 17 years old, and marriage seemed as distant as the mountains she had seen in pictures, but never in life. I will find him, she said, when the time is right. Torsten nodded. He seemed satisfied. What neither of them knew as they walked those golden fields in the dying light of summer was that the time for such dreams was already running out. The horse that would kill Torsten Lindahl was a gray mare named Petra. She had been with the family for 6 years, a gentle animal who had never shown a moment of violence in all that time. She carried Sina on her back when Sina was too small to climb into the saddle alone. She pulled the plow when the oxen were tired. She stood patient and calm while Torsten brushed her coat in the evening, speaking to her in the soft Norwegian words he had learned from his own father. Petra was family. And like so many tragedies, the one that took Torsten Lindahl began with something small, something random, something that could have happened to anyone at any time. It was September, 3 weeks after the harvest. Torsten had gone to check on the horses in the north pasture, a routine task he had performed 1,000 times before. Sina was in the soddy preparing the evening meal when she heard the sound. It was not a scream. Her father was not a man who screamed. It was something worse. A silence where there should have been noise. An absence where there should have been presence. She ran. The September sun was warm on her face as she sprinted across the field toward the north pasture. The wheat stubble scratched at her ankles. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She saw Petra first. The gray mare was standing at the far end of the pasture, her head down, her body trembling. Even from 100 yards away, Sina could see that something was terribly wrong. Then she saw her father. Torsten Lindahl lay on his back in the grass, his eyes open, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths. Blood pooled beneath his head, soaking into the earth that he had worked for 11 years. A rattlesnake slithered away through the grass, its body disappearing into a hole not 10 feet from where Torsten lay. Sina understood immediately what had happened. The snake had startled Petra. The mare had reared. Torsten, standing behind her, had taken the full force of her hooves to his skull. She fell to her knees beside him. "Father," she said. "Father, can you hear me?" Torsten's eyes moved slowly, finding her face. For a moment, something like recognition flickered in their depths. "Sina," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I am here," she said. "I am going to get help." But even as she said the words, she knew they were lies. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. The doctor was in Havenwood, 7 miles beyond that. By the time she could bring anyone back, her father would be gone. Torsten seemed to know it too. His hand moved, reaching for hers. She took it, feeling the rough calluses against her palm, the familiar strength that had lifted her onto horses and carried her through storms and built the only home she had ever known. "Find Niels," Torsten said. The words came slowly, each one requiring an effort that seemed to drain him further. "Old Niels, he will teach you." "Father," she said, the tears coming now hot and unstoppable. "Father, please." But Torsten Lindahl had given his last instruction. His hand went limp in hers. His eyes, still open, stared at the September sky. And Sina Lindahl, 17 years old, sat in the grass beside her father's body as the sun sank toward the horizon and the first stars appeared above the prairie. She did not move until morning. The funeral was held 3 days later. The people of Havenwood came as they always did for such occasions. Death was too common on the prairie to be ignored. Every family had lost someone. Every heart knew the weight of grief. They gathered at the small cemetery on the edge of town where wooden crosses marked the resting places of homesteaders who had come seeking a new life and found instead an early grave. Sina stood at the edge of the hole that would hold her father's body. She wore the black dress that had belonged to her mother, the only piece of her mother she had ever known. It hung loose on her shoulders, a reminder that she was still a girl, still growing, still becoming the woman she was meant to be. But inside, something had already changed. She watched the coffin lowered into the earth. She heard the words of the preacher speaking of heaven and salvation and the promise of reunion in a world beyond this one. She felt nothing. The grief would come later, she knew. It would come in waves that threatened to drown her in nights so dark she would forget that morning existed, in moments when she would turn to speak to her father and find only empty air. But in that moment at the edge of that grave, she felt only a cold, clear certainty. She was alone. Everything she had known was gone. And the people standing around her, their faces arranged in expressions of sympathy, were strangers who would not lift a finger to help her when the time came. She was right. The time came 3 days later. Maren had been Torsten's wife for 2 years. She was a woman from Minnesota, a widow who had lost her first husband to influenza and come west seeking a new start. She had met Torsten at a church social in Havenwood, and within 3 months they were married. Sina had never liked her. There was something false about Maren, a sweetness that felt manufactured, a concern that never quite reached her eyes. She smiled too much and laughed too loud and asked questions that seemed designed to gather information rather than express interest. But Torsten had been lonely. For 11 years he had raised his daughter alone, had worked the land, alone, had faced the endless challenges of prairie life with no partner to share the burden. When Maren appeared with her gentle voice and in her attentive manner, he had seen what he wanted to see. He had not seen what Sina saw. In the 2 years of the marriage, Maren had been careful. She had played the role of loving wife and concerned stepmother with a precision that suggested long practice. She had never raised her voice, never made demands, never given Torsten any reason to doubt his choice. But she had watched. She had watched the farm grow more valuable. She had watched the cattle multiply. She had watched Torsten's health, noting every cough, every moment of fatigue, every sign that the hard years were catching up with him. And she had waited. When the waiting ended, when Torsten's body was in the ground and the last mourners had gone home, Maren revealed herself. It happened on the morning of the 4th day. Sina was in the kitchen preparing breakfast as she had done every morning for years. The grief sat heavy in her chest, a weight that made every movement feel like wading through deep water. She heard Maren's footsteps behind her. "We need to talk," Maren said. Her voice was different. The sweetness was gone, replaced by something hard and flat and final. Sina turned. Maren stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her arms crossed, her face arranged in an expression that Sina had never seen before. It was the face of a woman who had been waiting a long time and was tired of waiting. "This homestead is mine now," Maren said. "The law says a widow inherits. You are not my daughter. You are not my responsibility." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Get out." Sina stared at her. For a moment, she could not understand what she was hearing. The words seemed to come from a great distance, as if spoken in a language she had once known but had forgotten. "What are you saying?" she asked. Maren smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I am saying that you have until sundown to leave. Take whatever you can carry. The rest belongs to me." "This was my father's land," Sina said. Her voice was steady, but inside her heart was racing. "He built this house. He worked this soil. He meant for it to come to me." Maren's smile widened. "Your father was a fool," she said. "A sentimental fool who never thought to put anything in writing. The law does not care what he meant. The law cares what is documented, and there is nothing documented that says you have any claim to this land." She stepped forward close enough that Sina could smell the lavender water she used to scent her hair. "You have until sundown," she repeated. "After that, I will have the sheriff remove you." Sina understood then. She understood that Maren had planned this. Perhaps not from the beginning, but certainly from the moment she realized that Torsten's health was failing, that the hard years were catching up with him, that his death was not a distant possibility, but an approaching certainty. She had waited because she knew the law was on her side. She had been kind because kindness cost her nothing, And now that Torsten was gone, she had no more use for pretense. Sina looked around the kitchen, the stove where she had cooked 1,000 meals, the table where she had sat with her father talking about the future, the window through which she had watched the seasons change year after year since she was 6 years old. This was her home, and she was being cast out of it like a stray dog. She did not beg. She did not cry. She did not give Marin the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply walked to the door, took her coat from the hook, and stepped out into the September morning. Behind her, Marin's voice followed. And do not think of coming back. I will have the sheriff waiting if you do. Sina did not turn around. She walked away from the only home she had ever known, leaving behind everything her father had built, everything she had thought would be hers. She walked toward the town of Havenwood because she had nowhere else to go. The town of Havenwood was small even by Dakota standards. It had grown up around a crossroads where the main trail from the east met the smaller paths that led to the scattered homesteads of the territory. There was a mercantile, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses where the town's permanent residents lived. Alderman Cornelius Whitmore was the closest thing Havenwood had to a leader. He owned the mercantile, who held the mortgage on half the farms in the county, and had appointed himself to the position of alderman 5 years earlier when no one else wanted the job. He was standing in front of his store when Sina walked into town. She had been walking for 2 hours. Her feet ached, her throat was dry, and the weight of her situation was beginning to settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She needed help. She needed someone to tell her what to do, where to go, how to survive. She approached Alderman Whitmore with the desperate hope of a girl who had not yet learned that the world owed her nothing. "Sir," she said, "my stepmother has turned me out of my home. I have nowhere to go. I was hoping." She did not finish the sentence. The look on Whitmore's face stopped her. It was not a look of sympathy. It was not even a look of concern. It was the look of a man observing something distasteful, something that offended his sense of proper order. "The Lindahl girl," he said. His voice was loud enough to carry to the people who had gathered to watch. "I heard about your father. A tragedy." He paused, adjusting his coat. "But I also heard about the circumstances of your departure from the homestead." Another pause. A decent girl would have made herself useful to her stepmother. A decent girl would have found a way to be of value. A decent girl would not be wandering the prairie like a vagrant, expecting others to solve her problems. The words hit Sina like physical blows. She had expected coldness, perhaps, indifference, certainly. But this casual cruelty, this public humiliation, was something she had not anticipated. She looked around at the faces of the townspeople. Some looked away embarrassed. Others watched with expressions of grim satisfaction, as if her misfortune confirmed something they had always believed. No one spoke in her defense. No one offered help. No one stepped forward to say that a 17-year-old girl should not be left alone on the prairie with nothing but the clothes on her back. That is what happens when you do not raise your children properly. Whitmore continued, warming to his audience. When you let them grow wild without teaching them the proper place of women in this world. He shook his head as if saddened by the moral failure he was witnessing. "I wish you well," he said, "but the people of Havenwood cannot be expected to support every unfortunate case that wanders through our town." He turned and walked into his store. The crowd dispersed, and Sina Lindahl stood alone in the dirt street, understanding for the first time that she had no one. No one except herself. She did not remember deciding to find old Niels Bergman. The name had risen from somewhere deep in her memory, carried by her father's dying words. "Find Niels. He will teach you." Niels Bergman was a legend in the territory, though not the kind of legend that anyone celebrated. He had homesteaded this land 30 years before there was a town back, when the Lakota still roamed free, and the nearest white settlement was 100 miles to the east. He had survived things that would have killed other men. Blizzards that buried cattle up to their necks in snow. Droughts that turned the prairie to dust. Grasshopper plagues that stripped the land bare in a matter of hours. Through it all, Niels Bergman had endured. He lived alone now, 5 miles from town, in a place that no one visited unless they had no other choice. He was 70 years old, they said, though he looked older. His hands were twisted with arthritis. His back was bent from decades of hard labor. His eyes, still sharp, held the weight of everything he had seen. Sina found him at sunset. His homestead was not what she expected. There was no house, no barn, no outbuildings of any kind. There was only a small entrance carved into the side of a hill, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. She stood at the entrance, uncertain whether to call out or simply wait. The decision was made for her. A voice emerged from the darkness of the hillside entrance, speaking in Norwegian. "You are Torsten's girl." It was not a question. Signa felt her heart tighten at the sound of her native language words she had not heard since her father died. "Yes," she said, "I am Signa." A figure emerged from the shadows. Old Niels Bergman was smaller than she expected, his frame shrunken by age, his movements slow and deliberate. But his eyes, when they met hers, were fierce with an intelligence that age had not dimmed. "Your father is dead," he said. "Yes." "And they threw you out." "Yes." Niels studied her for a long moment. His gaze was not unkind, but it was not soft either. It was the gaze of a man who had learned to measure people quickly, because on the prairie a wrong judgment could cost you your life. "Come inside," he said finally. "You look like you have not eaten in days." The interior of Niels Bergman's dugout was a revelation. Sina had grown up in a structure built on top of the ground from blocks of earth. She knew the smell of packed dirt, the feel of walls that sweated moisture in the summer and froze solid in the winter. This was different. The dugout was carved directly into the hillside, its walls reinforced with timber that Niels must have hauled from miles away. The ceiling was low but solid, supported by beams that had been in place for 3 decades. A small stove sat in one corner, its pipe disappearing into the earth above. The air was warm, not the oppressive warmth of a Saudi in summer or the fragile warmth of a house fighting against winter wind. This was a steady, consistent warmth that seemed to come from the earth itself. 55 degrees, Niels said, noticing her surprise. That is what the earth holds year-round. Does not matter if it is 40 below outside. The earth remembers summer. It keeps that warmth until summer comes again. He gestured for her to sit at a small table carved from cottonwood. "Your father," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "He was a good man, stubborn like all Norwegians, but good. He taught me everything I know," Sina said. "Not everything," Niels replied. He smiled, showing teeth worn down by decades of hard bread and harder living. "If he had taught you everything, you would not be here." He had meant to, Sina said. She felt the grief rising, the wave she had been holding back, threatening to overwhelm her. "He had meant to teach me more, but he ran out of time." Niels nodded. "Time," he said. "The one thing no one can save. The one thing no one can buy." "Your father had 11 years with you. More than many get, less than he deserved." He rose and moved to the stove where a pot of stew sat warming. "Eat," he said, ladling the food into a wooden bowl. "Then we will talk about what comes next." Sina ate. The stew was simple rabbit and root vegetables, but it was the first real food she had tasted in days. The warmth of it spread through her body, loosening the tension she had been carrying since she walked away from her father's grave. When she finished, Niels spoke. "I learned this," he said, gesturing at the walls around them, from the Lakota. 30 years ago, when I first came to this land, they were still here. They taught me how to survive in ways the white man had forgotten." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "They taught me that the earth is not your enemy. The earth is your ally if you know how to listen." They built shelters that could disappear completely under a blanket of snow, shelters invisible to enemies, shelters that kept them alive when everything above ground was dying. Sina listened. "Your father knew this?" Niels continued. "I taught him years ago. He never built one himself. He had his sadi. He thought it was enough." He paused. "It was enough until it was not." "I need to learn," Sina said. The words came without thought, driven by something deeper than conscious decision. "I need to build. I have nowhere else to go." Niels studied her again, that same measuring gaze. "There is land," he said finally. 30 acres on the edge of your father's old claim. The part that your stepmother does not know about. The part your father never bothered to file because he thought it was worthless." His smile returned. "It is not worthless. It is perfect. A south-facing hillside, hidden from every direction. If you build right, no one will ever find you." "Maren will look for me," Sina said. "She will not find you," Niels replied. "Not if you learn what I have to teach." The next morning, Niels led her to the hillside. It was 5 miles from town, far enough to be isolated, close enough to reach supplies when necessary. The slope faced south, catching the full warmth of the winter sun. A fold in the terrain hid the approach from every direction. Here, Neil said, this is where you will build. Signa looked at the hillside. She saw dead grass and frozen earth. She saw a challenge that seemed impossible. But she also saw her father's face, heard his words from years before. The land does not lie. It shows you what it is. It gives you what you earn. She would earn this. Niels taught her the principles. How to cut sod blocks that would hold together. How to angle the entrance so water would drain away. How to build walls that would never burn and never blow away. But Sina did the work. Her hands, soft from years of kitchen work, hardened on the handle of the shovel. Her shoulders, slender from girlhood, grew strong with the labor of cutting earth. Her back, straight and young, learned the ache of hours spent digging into the frozen ground. October turned to November. November turned to December, and the dugout grew. 12 feet wide, 20 feet deep. Walls of packed earth that held the warmth of the ground. A ceiling reinforced with cottonwood timbers hauled from the creek 3 miles away. A stove that burned efficiently, sending its smoke through a pipe so thin it looked like nothing more than a stick poking out of the ground. Niels came when he could, his old body no longer able to make the journey more than once or twice a week. He inspected her work. He offered corrections. He watched her grow from a girl who had lost everything into a woman who was building her future with her own hands. You are doing well, he told her one December evening as they sat in the half-finished dugout and watched the light fade from the entrance. Better than I expected. Better than most men could manage. Sina smiled, though the exhaustion sat heavy on her. I had a good teacher, she said. You had a good father, Niels corrected. I am only reminding you of what he already gave you. The first search party came in late October. Alderman Whitmore led it himself, 12 men on horseback, riding out to the hillside where rumor said the Lindahl girl was digging herself a hole in the ground. They expected to find her squatting in a pit covered in dirt, desperate for rescue. They found nothing. The entrance was hidden behind a fold in the hill, invisible from the direction they approached. The chimney pipe was buried under a pile of rocks that looked completely natural. The only sign that anyone had been there was the faint smell of smoke in the cold air. She is not here, one of the men said. She was here, Whitmore insisted. Look at the disturbed earth. Someone has been digging. Prairie dogs, another man suggested. Or badgers. Plenty of animals dig in these hills. They searched for an hour, walking the hillside looking for any sign of habitation. They walked directly over Sina's roof without knowing it was there. She lay in the darkness below, listening to their voices, feeling the vibration of their footsteps through the packed earth above her head. Her heart pounded so loud she was certain they would hear it, but they heard nothing. When they finally left, Whitmore was furious. The girl is up to something, he declared. Mark my words, no decent person hides like this. She is probably stealing from the farms around here, living off what she can take. But there was no evidence of theft. There was no evidence of anything at all, only the smoke rising from nowhere, mocking everything Cornelius Whitmore believed about his ability to control the world around him. The second search came in November. This time Whitmore brought dogs. Signa had prepared for this. Old Niels had warned her. She had scattered pepper and dried chili around the perimeter of her claim, enough to confuse any animal that tried to track her scent. The dogs ran in circles, sneezing and whining, unable to find the trail. Whitmore stood on the hillside again, staring at the wisp of smoke rising from the ground. There has to be something here, he said. Someone is burning fuel. Someone is surviving. But there was nothing to find. The entrance was hidden. The chimney was disguised. The girl who lived beneath his feet might as well have been a ghost. The third search came in December. It was the one where Whitmore stood directly on her roof, his boots 10 feet from her door, his voice carrying clearly through the packed earth. The girl is dead, he said, froze out there somewhere. The smoke must be some kind of natural phenomenon. Signa lay in her bed, warm and fed and alive, and listened to the man who had called her a vagrant declare her dead. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt only a quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who had been told she would fail and had refused to accept the verdict. By January, the dugout was complete. Sina stood in the center of her home and looked at what she had built. A bed carved into one wall, piled with buffalo hides that Niels had given her from his cash. A table and chairs made from cottonwood, rough but functional. Shelves lined with preserved food, vegetables from a hidden garden, meat, smoked from rabbits and prairie chickens. A stove that kept the space warm with minimal fuel, its heat supplementing the constant 55 degrees of the earth. She had done this, not Neil's though he had guided her, not her father though he had given her the foundation. She, Sina Lindahl, 17 years old, cast out with nothing, had built herself a home that no one could find, that no one could take away. Outside, the winter wind howled across the prairie. The temperature dropped to 30 below. The snow piled in drifts that buried fences and blocked roads and trapped animals in their shelters. Inside, Sina was warm. Old Niels came to see her on a day when the cold had briefly relented, allowing him to make the journey from his own dugout. He walked through the hidden entrance, stood in the center of the main room, and smiled. "Your father would be proud," he said. "This is better than anything I ever built. Warmer, tighter, more hidden." Signa felt the tears come the first she had allowed herself since her father's funeral. "They will never find me here," she said. No, Niels agreed. "They will not." He moved to the stove, warming his arthritic hands over its heat. "But someday," he said, his voice growing serious, "they may need to." Sina looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Winter is not over," Niels said. "I have seen the signs. I have watched the sky, the animals, the way the wind changes direction without warning. There is a storm coming. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but soon. The kind of storm that kills everything it touches." He turned to face her, his old eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When that storm comes, this place will be the only shelter for miles. The people of Havenwood in their wooden buildings and their soddies, they will die. Their fires will not be enough. Their walls will not hold." He paused. "They laughed at you. They said you were living like an animal. They said no decent person hides like this." His voice softened. "When the storm comes, they will be dissing like animals, and you will have a choice to make." Sina did not respond. She did not know what to say. The people of Havenwood had abandoned her. They had watched her walk away with nothing and done nothing to help. They had listened to Whitmore call her a vagrant and nodded their agreement. Why should she save them? Neil seemed to read her thoughts. "I am not telling you what to do," he said. "The choice will be yours, but remember this, the person you become in that moment is the person you will be for the rest of your life." He moved toward the entrance, preparing to leave. "Your father was a good man," he said over his shoulder. "Not because he was never wronged, but because he never let being wrong turn him into something less than he was." He stepped out into the cold. And Sina Lindahl sat alone in her underground home, watching the smoke rise from her chimney, wondering what kind of person she would choose to be when the storm finally came. Outside, the winter deepened. The smoke rose from the hillside every morning, and somewhere in the distance, gathering strength over the frozen plains, the storm of the century was beginning to build. February arrived with a lie. The days grew longer. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The worst of the winter cold seemed to be loosening its grip on the Dakota prairie, retreating north like a defeated army. The people of Havenwood allowed themselves to hope. They had survived another winter. The cattle had made it through. The stores of food and fuel, though diminished, had held. In another month, the ground would thaw. In another 2 months, they would be planting again. But the land does not lie, and those who knew how to listen could hear something wrong in the wind. Sina Lindahl stood at the entrance of her dugout on the first morning of February, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. The air was warmer than it should have been. 40 degrees perhaps. Warm enough that she did not need her heavy coat. It felt wrong. She had lived on the prairie her entire life. She knew its rhythms, its patterns, its moods. And this warmth, this fall spring arriving 2 months too early, made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Something was coming. She could not say what. She could not point to evidence or cite reason. But the feeling sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Something was coming, and the warmth was not a blessing. It was a warning. In Havenwood, the people celebrated. The mercantile was busy that morning, farmers coming in from their homesteads to buy supplies and exchange gossip. The saloon was already serving drinks by noon, men gathering to toast the early end of winter and speculate about the growing season ahead. Alderman Cornelius Whitmore stood behind the counter of his store, listening to the chatter of his customers with a satisfaction that bordered on smugness. Another winter survived, he thought. Another year of proof that he had built something solid here, something that would endure. But even as he congratulated himself, a fragment of conversation caught his attention. "Did you see the smoke this morning?" one farmer was saying to another. "Still rising from that hillside, clear as day." His companion nodded. "Going on 5 months now. every single morning, and nobody can find where it is coming from. Whitmore's jaw tightened. The smoke from nowhere. It had become a joke in Havenwood, a mystery that people discussed in the mercantile and laughed about in the saloon. Some said it was a ghost. Some said it was gas escaping from the ground. Some said it was proof that the earth itself was burning. And some said quietly when they thought no one important was listening, that it was the Lindahl girl. Still alive, still surviving, still defying every prediction of her death. Whitmore hated those whispers most of all. He had declared her dead. He had stood before the town council and announced with absolute certainty that the girl had frozen somewhere on the prairie, that the smoke was a natural phenomenon, that the matter was closed. But the smoke kept rising. Every morning, without fail. A thin gray thread climbing into the sky from a hillside where 3 search parties had found nothing. It mocked him. It suggested that Cornelius Whitmore, the most powerful man in Havenwood, could not find a 17-year-old girl hiding in a hole in the ground. Maybe she is alive, one of the farmers said, his voice carrying across the store. Maybe she built herself one of those underground places, like old Niels Bergman. Whitmore slammed his hand on the counter. The store went silent. Old Niels Bergman. Whitmore said, his voice dripping with contempt, is a crazy Norwegian who lives like a prairie dog. If the Lindahl girl is imitating him, she will be dead before spring. The ground kills people who try to live in it. He looked around at the faces of his customers, daring anyone to contradict him. No one did. The matter is closed, Whitmore continued. The girl is dead, the smoke is nothing, and I do not want to hear another word about it. He turned and walked into the back room of his store. Behind him, the farmers exchanged glances, but said nothing. Cornelius Whitmore was not a man you disagreed with. Not if you wanted to keep your mortgage. Not if you wanted to keep your standing in the community. Not if you wanted to survive in Havenwood. But the smoke kept rising, and the whispers did not stop. Sina knew nothing of the whispers. She knew nothing of the debates in the mercantile, the jokes in the saloon, the growing legend of the smoke from nowhere. Her world had shrunk to the size of her dugout and the land immediately surrounding it. And that was enough. The life she had built for herself in the months since October was unlike anything she had known before. It was harder than life on her father's farm, where there had been neighbors to help with the harvest, a town to provide supplies, a community to offer support in times of crisis. Here there was only herself. But there was freedom in that solitude, a fierce, unexpected freedom that Sina had never imagined she would find. She rose each morning before dawn, when the darkness was still thick and the cold was at its deepest. She built up the fire in her stove, not with the carelessness of someone who had fuel to spare, but with the precision of someone who knew that every stick of wood was precious. She had gathered that wood herself, hauling it 3 miles from the creek where cottonwoods grew along the banks. She had cut it with an axe that Niels had given her, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. She had stacked it in a cache near the entrance of her dugout, covered with buffalo hides to keep it dry. Every stick represented hours of labor. Every stick represented survival. After the fire was burning, she would check her traps. She had learned to set snares for rabbits in the draws and gullies where they sheltered from the wind. She had learned to build deadfalls for prairie chickens along the paths they traveled to find food. She had learned to read the tracks in the snow, to know which animals had passed and when to predict where they would be and how to catch them. Her father had taught her the basics. Old Niels had taught her the refinements. But it was Sina herself who had mastered the skills, who had transformed theoretical knowledge into practical ability, who had become in the space of 5 months a hunter capable of feeding herself through the harshest winter the territory had ever seen. Some days the traps were empty. Those were hard days. Days when the hunger gnawed at her stomach and the cold seemed to seep into her bones despite the warmth of her dugout. Days when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if she should have stayed in Havenwood, if she should have found some way to make peace with Marin and Whitmore and all the others who had cast her out. But those thoughts never lasted long. She would remember the look in Whitmore's face when he called her a vagrant. She would remember the silence of the townspeople as they watched her walk away. She would remember Marin's smile, cold and triumphant, as she threw her out of the only home she had ever known. And the anger would return. Not the hot, destructive anger of someone bent on revenge. Something colder. Something harder. The anger of someone who had been told she would fail and had decided with every fiber of her being to prove them wrong. That anger kept her alive on the empty days. It kept her checking the traps even when her hands were numb with cold. It kept her hauling wood even when her shoulders ached from the weight. It kept her building and improving and preparing for whatever came next, because something always came next, and Sina Lindahl intended to be ready for it. The fourth search party came in the second week of February. This one was different from the others. Whitmore had not announced his intentions. He had not gathered men in the town square and led them out in a show of civic authority. Instead, he had come quietly with only two companions arriving at the hillside just after dawn. Sina heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses' hooves on frozen ground carries far in the winter air. She was checking her traps when the rhythm reached her ears, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. 3 horses, moving slowly, deliberately, not the scattered approach of men who did not know what they were looking for, but the focused advance of hunters who believed they were close to their prey. She abandoned the trap line and ran. The entrance to her dugout was hidden behind a fold in the terrain invisible from most approaches. But if they came from the east, if they followed the ridge line instead of crossing the valley, they might see the slight depression in the ground that marked the location of her home. She reached the entrance just as the riders crested the ridge. For one terrible moment, she was certain they had seen her. Whitmore was leading, his eyes scanning the hillside with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Behind him rode 2 men she did not recognize, their faces hard and weathered, the faces of men who made their living tracking things that did not want to be found. Bounty hunters. Whitmore had hired bounty hunters to find her. Signa slipped through the entrance to her dugout and pulled the door closed behind her. Her heart was pounding so loud she was certain they would hear it through the earth. She pressed her ear against the door and listened. Voices, distant at first, then growing closer. The smoke was coming from right around here, Whitmore was saying. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. I have watched it every morning for months. It rises from this slope. Could be a natural vent, one of the hunters replied. Gas escaping from coal deposits. We have seen it before. It is not natural, Whitmore insisted. Someone is burning fuel. Someone is surviving out here. Footsteps now. Heavy boots on frozen ground. Coming closer. Sina held her breath. She heard them walking the hillside, their steps making the earth above her tremble slightly. They were methodical, these hunters. They moved in patterns, covering ground systematically, looking for any sign of disturbance. Check over there, Whitmore commanded. Behind those rocks. The footsteps moved away, then returned. Nothing. Just more rocks. And here, this depression in the ground. Sagna felt her heart stop. The depression, the slight dip in the terrain that marked where she had dug out the main chamber of her dugout. She had tried to disguise it, had piled rocks and dead grass over it, but to a trained eye it might still be visible. The footsteps came closer. She could hear breathing now. Heavy, labored breathing of a man who had been walking uphill. Whitmore, she thought. He is standing right above me. Looks like an old buffalo wallow, one of the hunters said. Ground settles like that, where the herds used to roll. Whitmore did not respond immediately. Signa could imagine him standing there, staring at the ground beneath his feet, sensing that something was not right, but unable to identify what. The silence stretched on. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then Whitmore stamped his foot. The impact sent a small shower of dirt cascading from Sina's ceiling. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Solid ground, Whitmore said. His voice was heavy with frustration. Just solid ground. She is not here, Mr. Whitmore, the hunter said. We have covered every inch of this hillside. If there was a structure, we would have found it. The smoke comes from somewhere, Whitmore replied. Maybe it does, but it does not come from here. We will try the next ridge over. The footsteps began to recede. Sina allowed herself to breathe, but Whitmore's voice stopped her. Wait. The footsteps stopped. Do you smell that? Silence, then one of the hunters spoke. Wood smoke. Faint, but definitely wood smoke. Sina's blood turned to ice. She had let the fire burn too high that morning, trying to warm the dugout after a night when the temperature had dropped unexpectedly. The smoke would have been thicker than usual, and the smell would have lingered in the air even after she had banked the coals. It is coming from somewhere nearby, Whitmore said. Spread out. Find the source. For the next hour they searched. Sina lay in the darkness of her dugout, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. She heard them walking over her roof around her entrance past her hidden chimney. She heard them arguing about the direction of the wind, the source of the smell, the impossibility of finding something that should have been obvious. She heard Whitmore growing more and more frustrated as the search yielded nothing. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, he gave up. "The girl is dead," he announced, as if saying it with enough conviction would make it true. "She died months ago. The smoke is some kind of natural phenomenon that we do not understand." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something dangerous in his voice. "But I want you to keep watching. If anyone sees anything unusual on this hillside, I want to know about it immediately." The horses moved away. Signa waited until she could no longer hear them. Then she allowed herself to breathe. She had survived. Again. She had remained hidden when discovery seemed certain. She had outlasted the most powerful man in the territory and the hunters he had hired to find her. But she understood now that it would never end. Whitmore would keep searching. He would keep sending parties to the hillside. He would keep looking for the source of the smoke that mocked his certainty. As long as she lived here, she would be hunted. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it made her determined. Let him search, she thought. Let him send 100 bounty hunters. Let him spend the rest of his life looking for a girl he has already declared dead. He will never find me. And someday, when he needs me most, I will decide whether he deserves to be found. The days that followed were strange ones. The warmth that had arrived in early February continued growing more pronounced as the week went on. By the middle of the month, the temperature had climbed to 50 degrees, an unheard of reading for Dakota in winter. The snow began to melt. Rivulets of water ran down the hillside, carving channels in the frozen ground. The prairie, which had been white and silent for months, began to show patches of brown where the grass was emerging from beneath its icy blanket. The people of Haven Woods celebrated. They came out of their homes and stood in the sunshine, their faces turned toward the sky. They talked about early planning, about the blessing of a mild winter, about the fortune that had smiled upon them. They did not notice the birds. Sana did. She stood at the entrance of her dugout on the morning of February 15th and watched a flock of geese pass overhead. They were flying south, which was wrong. By February, the geese should have been flying north, returning to their summer breeding grounds. But these birds were fleeing, hundreds of them, thousands, a river of wings flowing across the sky, heading away from something that only they could sense. She watched them until they disappeared over the southern horizon. Then she began to prepare. She did not know what was coming. She could not name the threat or predict its timing, but the land was speaking to her in the language her father had taught her to understand, and it was saying one thing: danger. She worked through the day and into the night. She hauled more wood from her cache, stacking it inside the dugout until there was barely room to move. She checked her food stores, counting the preserved vegetables, the smoked meat, the dried berries she had gathered in the fall. She reinforced the entrance, packing additional earth around the frame, making sure it would hold against whatever pressure might come. She worked until her arms ached and her back screamed for rest. And when she finally lay down to sleep, she dreamed of snow. Not the gentle snow of a normal Dakota winter. Something else. Something massive and violent and unstoppable. A wall of white advancing across the prairie, swallowing everything in its path. She woke with the dream still vivid in her mind and the certainty that it was not a dream at all. It was a vision of what was to come. Old Niels arrived 3 days later. Sina heard him coming long before she saw him. The sound of his shuffling footsteps on the hillside, slower than they had been in the fall, more labored. The wheezing of his breath as he climbed the slope. He was getting weaker. She met him at the entrance to her dugout and helped him inside, guiding him to the chair beside the stove where he could warm himself. "You felt it," he said when he had caught his breath. It was not a question. Signa nodded. "The birds," she said. "The warmth. Something is wrong." Niels looked at her with eyes that had seen 70 winters on this prairie. "The Lakota had a name for it," he said. "They called it the White Death. A storm that comes without warning, that kills everything it touches, that leaves nothing alive in its wake." He paused, his gaze distant. "I saw one once, 53 winters ago. I was young then, strong. I survived because I had already learned to build into the earth. But the people around me, the ones who lived in houses above the ground, they died. All of them." Signa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. when she asked. Soon Niels replied, days perhaps, a week at most. The land is preparing. Can you not feel it? She could feel it. The wrongness of the warm days, the desperation of the fleeing birds, the strange stillness that had settled over the prairie as if the world itself was holding its breath. The people of Havenwood, she said, they do not know. Neil shook his head. They do not listen. I tried to warn them. I went to town yesterday, spoke to Whitmore himself. He laughed at me. The old man's face twisted with something between anger and sorrow. Superstition, he called it. The ramblings of a crazy old Norwegian. He said they had survived Dakota winters before and would survive this one too. Sina thought of the townspeople, the families with children, the elderly who could not run or hide, the animals in their barns trusting their owners to keep them safe. She thought of Whitmore standing in his mercantile congratulating himself on his solid buildings and his abundant stores. She thought of Myron living in the house that should have been Sina's, sleeping in the bed where Sina's father had died. They will not survive, she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. If what you say is true, they will not survive. No, Niels agreed, they will not. He leaned forward, his old hands reaching for hers. But you will. Sina looked at him. His face was lined with age, weathered by decades of wind and cold. But his eyes were clear, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Pride. You have built something here, he said. Something I could not have built at your age. Something your father would have wept to see. When the storm comes, this place will hold. The earth will keep you warm. The walls will keep you safe. He squeezed her hands. You will survive. Sina felt tears threatening, but she blinked them back. And the others, she asked, what happens to them? Niels released her hands and sat back in his chair. That, he said, is what I came to talk to you about. He was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When the storm passes, he said finally, you will be the only shelter for Miles. The only warmth, the only hope. The people of Havenwood, if any survive the first days, will need a place to go. They will need someone to save them. Sina felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. They cast me out, she said. They watched me walk away with nothing. They laughed when Whitmore called me a vagrant. I know, Niels said. Why should I save them? The question hung in the air between them. Niels did not answer immediately. He stared into the fire, his face unreadable. When I was young, he said at last, I asked myself the same question. The people who died in that storm 53 years ago, they were not kind to me. They called me names I will not repeat. They made my life difficult in 100 small ways. He turned to look at her. And when they came to me, desperate in dying, I had to decide. Would I let the past determine the future? Would I punish them for their cruelty by adding my own? What did you do, Sina asked. I let them in, Niels said. Every one of them. I shared my food and my warmth and my shelter. I saved the lives of people who had made my life miserable. And afterward they were different. Not all of them. Some went back to their old ways as soon as the danger passed. But others, many others, they saw me differently. They understood what I had done. They became, if not friends, then at least people who no longer wished me harm. He rose from his chair, moving toward the entrance of the dugout. I am not telling you what to do, he said. The choice will be yours. But remember this, the person you become in that moment is the person you will be for the rest of your life. He paused at the entrance, turning back to look at her one last time. Your father was a good man, not because he was never wronged, but because he never let being wronged turn him into something less than he was. He stepped out into the pale sunlight, and Sina Lindahl sat alone in her underground home, watching the fire burn, thinking about storms and choices, and the kind of person she wanted to be. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended state. The warmth continued. The sun shone. The people of Havenwood went about their business as if the world was not preparing to end. Sina worked. She could not stop working. The certainty of the coming storm drove her like a whip, pushing her to prepare to stockpile to reinforce. She dug an additional chamber off the main room of her dugout, a small space where food could be stored away from the heat of the stove. She hauled more wood until her arms felt like they might fall off. She checked and rechecked her chimney, making sure it would not be blocked by snow. And she watched the sky. The clouds were wrong. She could not have explained it to anyone who had not spent their life reading the weather. But the clouds were wrong. They moved too fast in directions that did not match the wind at ground level. They had a color she had never seen before, a yellowish gray that reminded her of bruised flesh. Something was building up there, something massive, something that the warm days and the sunny skies were only hiding. On the 28th day of February, the temperature dropped in 15 degrees overnight. Sina woke to a change in the air, a heaviness that pressed against her chest like a physical weight. She built up the fire and sat beside it waiting. She thought about what Niels had said. The person you become in that moment is the person you will be for the rest of your life. She thought about her father, not because he was never wronged, but because he never let being wrong turn him into something less than he was. She thought about the people of Havenwood, the children who had done nothing wrong, the elderly who had earned the right to die in their beds, the families who were simply trying to survive just as she was. And she thought about Whitmore, the man who had called her a vagrant, who had led search parties to find her, who had hired bounty hunters to track her down, who had declared her dead when he could not find her. Did he deserve to be saved? Did any of them? She did not know the answer, but she knew one thing. When the moment came, she would have to choose. And whatever she chose, she would have to live with for the rest of her life. The smoke rose from the hillside that morning, thin and gray against the winter sky, and somewhere in the distance, gathering its final strength, the storm of the century prepared to descend upon the Dakota prairie. The blizzard came on March 2nd, 1887. It came without warning as Nils had predicted it would. Or rather, it came with warnings that no one had heeded, warnings written in the behavior of birds and the wrongness of the weather and the ancient knowledge of people who had learned to read the land. The morning was mild, almost pleasant. The people of Havenwood emerged from their homes and remarked on the beauty of the day, on the promise of spring that seemed to hang in the air. By noon, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees. By evening, the wind was howling at 60 miles per hour, and the snow was falling so thick that you could not see your hand in front of your face. By midnight, people were dying. Sina heard the storm arrive from the safety of her dugout. She had known it was coming. She had felt the change in the air that morning, the subtle shift in pressure that preceded the violence. She had spent the hours before the storm checking her preparations one final time, making sure everything was ready. Now she sat beside her stove, listening to the fury outside, and thought about the people of Havenwood. They would be huddled in their homes, she knew, burning their furniture for warmth as their wood piles ran out, watching the walls shake with each gust of wind, praying for a dawn that seemed like it would never come. Some of them would not see that dawn. Some of them were already dead. She thought about the children, the little ones who had done nothing wrong, who had never laughed at her or called her names. They would be frightened, clinging to their mothers, not understanding why the world had turned so cruel. She thought about the elderly, the men and women who had survived decades on the prairie, who had built homes and raised families and earned the right to die peacefully in their beds. They would be the first to fall when the cold became too much, their old bodies unable to fight what the young could endure. She thought about Whitmore. The alderman would be in his mercantile surrounded by the goods he had spent years accumulating. His solid building would be shaking in the wind. His abundant stores would mean nothing if the walls came down around him. Was he afraid? Sina hoped he was. She hoped he was feeling, for the first time in his life, the terror of being powerless. The terror of knowing that all his money and all his influence could not save him from the simple reality of cold. But even as she hoped for his fear, she knew that hoping was not enough. When the storm ended, she would have a choice to make, and she had already made it. The storm lasted 7 days. 7 days of howling wind and driving snow and temperatures that dropped to 50 degrees below zero. 7 days of watching fuel supplies dwindle and food run out and hope fade into despair. In her dugout, Sana survived. The earth kept her warm as Niels had promised it would. The walls held against the fury of the wind. The chimney remained clear, carrying away the smoke of her stove, while letting fresh air seep in through the cracks she had deliberately left in the construction. She rationed her food carefully, eating just enough to maintain her strength. She rationed her wood, keeping the fire at the minimum level needed to supplement the natural warmth of the earth. And she waited. On the second day, she began to worry about the chimney. Snow could block it. If enough accumulated on the surface, it could seal the pipe completely, and then the smoke from her stove would have nowhere to go. It would fill the dugout. She would suffocate. She had prepared for this possibility, had built the chimney with a curve that would prevent blockage under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. She climbed onto the chair beside the stove and pressed her ear against the pipe. She could hear air moving through it, a faint whistle that told her the passage was still clear. For now. On the third day, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Screaming, faint, carried on the wind, coming from somewhere to the east, the direction of Havenwood. She pressed her ear against the wall of her dugout and listened. The screaming faded, swallowed by the roar of the storm. She never heard it again. On the fourth day, she ran out of things to do. She had checked her food stores. She had inspected every corner of her dugout for leaks or weaknesses. She had counted her wood and calculated how long it would last. There was nothing left to occupy her hands. So she occupied her mind. She thought about her father, about the years they had spent together on the prairie, building their life one day at a time, about the lessons he had taught her, not just the practical skills of survival, but the deeper lessons about character and choice. She thought about her mother, whom she had never known. She wondered what kind of woman she had been, whether she had been strong or gentle, whether Sina had inherited her eyes or her smile or the shape of her hands. She thought about the future. If she survived this storm, what would she do? She could stay here in her hidden home on the hillside. She could live out her life in isolation, forgotten by the world, needing no one and needed by no one. It was a tempting thought, but she knew even as she considered it that it was not who she wanted to be. Her father had not raised her to hide from the world. He had raised her to face it, to meet its challenges head on, to build something that would last. Hiding was survival, but it was not living. On the fifth day, the wind died down just enough for her to open the door and look outside. The world was white. Snow had drifted against the hillside in waves 20 feet high. The landscape she knew had been erased, replaced by an alien terrain of peaks and valleys sculpted by the wind. And in the distance, barely visible through the swirling flakes, she could see smoke. Not one column, but several. Rising from the direction of Havenwood. Rising and then bending, torn apart by the wind before they could climb more than a few feet into the air. Someone was still alive out there. Someone was still fighting. She closed the door and returned to her vigil. 2 more days. 2 more days of wind and cold, and the distant knowledge that people were dying while she sat safe and warm in her underground home. 2 more days of waiting. On the morning of the 8th day, the storm broke. Sina woke to silence. After 7 days of constant noise, the absence of sound was almost painful. Her ears rang with it. Her mind, accustomed to the rhythm of the wind, struggled to adjust to the stillness. She rose from her bed and moved to the door of her dugout. The hinges creaked as she pushed it open. The sky was clear. For the first time in a week, she could see the sun. It hung low on the eastern horizon, a pale disk that offered light without warmth. Its rays fell on a landscape that bore no resemblance to the one she had known. Snow everywhere. Drifts that rose like mountains, concealing fences and roads, and anything that might have helped her orient herself. The hillside where her dugout lay was buried under feet of white, the only visible feature being the thin wisp of smoke that rose from her hidden chimney. The smoke from nowhere, still rising, still defying the world's attempts to extinguish it. She stood at the entrance of her dugout and breathed the cold, clean air. Somewhere out there in the direction of Havenwood, survivors were waking to the same silence. They were counting their dead. They were assessing the damage. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, how close they had come to extinction. And some of them, the desperate ones, the ones who had nowhere else to turn, were looking at the hillside. They were seeing the smoke. They were remembering the stories they had heard, the jokes they had told. The girl who had disappeared, who had built herself a hole in the ground, who had been declared dead by Alderman Whitmore 5 months ago. Maybe she was alive. Maybe she could help. Maybe, just maybe, the smoke from nowhere could save them. Sina watched the horizon and waited for them to come. They appeared at midday, a ragged column of figures struggling through the snow, their movements slow and painful. They looked like ghosts, their clothes covered in white, their faces hidden behind scarves and wrappings that protected them from the cold. Sina counted them as they approached. 23. 23 survivors out of a town that had held nearly 100 people before the storm. She recognized some of them as they drew closer. The blacksmith, his massive frame bent under the weight of exhaustion. The school teacher, her skirts dragging through the snow. 2 of the farmers who had stood in the mercantile and listened, while Whitmore declared her dead. And at the front of the column leading the way was Alderman Cornelius Whitmore himself. He looked different. The arrogance that had always defined him was gone. His shoulders were slumped. His head was bowed. He moved like a man who had been broken, who had seen everything he believed in collapse around him. He was carrying a child, a small girl 6 years old wrapped in blankets and pressed against his chest. Her face was pale, her eyes closed. Sina could not tell if she was sleeping or something worse. The column stopped at the base of the hillside. Whitmore looked up at the slope at the wisp of smoke rising from somewhere above. He could not see the entrance to the dugout. Even now, after months of searching, the hidden door remained invisible to those who did not know where to look. "Hello," he called out. His voice was hoarse, weakened by cold and exhaustion. "Is anyone there, please? We need help." Sina did not respond. She stood at the entrance of her dugout, hidden in the shadow of the fold in the terrain, and watched the man who had called her a vagrant beg for mercy. "Please," Whitmore called again. "There are children with us. Old people. They will die if we do not find shelter." Still, Sine did not respond. She was not being cruel. She was not savoring his desperation. She was simply watching, observing, taking the measure of this moment that would define everything that came after. "I know you are there," Whitmore said. His voice cracked. "The smoke, I can see it. Someone is alive up there. Someone is surviving." He fell to his knees in the snow. The child in his arms stirred but did not wake. "Please," he said, and now his voice was barely a whisper. "I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what survival looks like. About what decency means. I was wrong." He bowed his head. "If you are there, please help us. Not for my sake. I do not deserve help. But for the children. For the innocent ones who did nothing wrong." Sina stepped out of the shadows. The movement caught Whitmore's attention. He looked up, and for the first time he saw her. She stood at the entrance of her dugout, framed by the rocks that concealed it, her face expressionless. She was thinner than she had been 5 months ago, hardened by the work of survival. But she was alive. She was warm. She was everything he had said she could not be. "I know you," she said. Her voice carried clearly in the cold air. "You said I was living like an animal. You said no decent person hides like this. You led search parties to find me and drive me out." Whitmore's face contorted with shame. "I was wrong," he repeated. "I was a fool. I deserve whatever you choose to do to me." Sina looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the people behind him. The desperate faces, the frostbitten hands, the eyes that held no more mockery, only fear. She looked at the child in his arms. The small girl who had done nothing wrong, who had simply been born into a world that was cruel and cold and unforgiving. And she thought about her father. She thought about the lessons he had taught her. Not just how to survive, but how to live. Not just how to endure the cruelty of others, but how to remain better than that cruelty. The land does not lie, he had told her. But people lie. People make promises they do not keep. People smile while they plan your destruction. And yet he had also taught her something else. He had taught her that the measure of a person is not how they treat those who treat them well. The measure of a person is how they treat those who treat them poorly. He had taught her that vengeance is easy, but forgiveness is strength. He had taught her that the person you become in your darkest moment is the person you will be for the rest of your life. Sina made her choice. "Come in," she said. Whitmore looked at her, disbelief written on his face. "All of you," she continued. "There is room." She stepped aside, revealing the entrance to her dugout. The 23 survivors of Havenwood filed past her one by one, descending into the earth that had sheltered her through the storm. Some of them looked at her as they passed. Some of them could not meet her eyes. Whitmore was the last. He stopped at the entrance, still holding the child. "Why?" he asked. His voice was barely audible. "After everything I said, after everything I did, why are you helping us?" Sina looked at him. "Because my father would have helped you," she said. "Because this is what decent people do. Because you are human beings, even if you were not very good at being human beings when times were easy." She paused. "And because I choose to be better than you were." Whitmore closed his eyes. A tear escaped and froze on his cheek. Then he stepped inside, and Sina closed the door behind them, shutting out the cold and the snow and the world that had tried so hard to destroy them all. The dugout that everyone had laughed at, the hole in the ground that Alderman Whitmore had searched for and never found, held 23 people for 2 weeks. It was not comfortable. The space that had seemed generous when Cena lived there alone became cramped and close with so many bodies. People slept in shifts, taking turns on the bed and the floor. The air grew thick with the smell of too many humans in too small a space. But it was warm, and that was all that mattered. Cena gave them everything she had. She shared her food, the vegetables she had preserved, the meat she had smoked, the dried berries she had gathered in the fall. She shared her fuel, the wood she had hauled 3 miles from the creek. She shared her blankets, the buffalo hides that Niels had given her. She kept nothing for herself. When someone asked her why, she simply shrugged. "You need it," she said. "I can get more when the snow melts." It was not entirely true. Her supplies were finite, and feeding 23 people for 2 weeks would deplete them severely. But it was true enough. She would survive. She always survived. The first days were the hardest. People were in shock. They had lost family members, friends, neighbors. They had watched their homes collapse around them. They had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They sat in the close warmth of the dugout and stared at nothing, their minds struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. 17 people had died in Havenwood. 17 people who had been alive a week ago, who had walked the streets and worked the fields and made plans for the future. Gone. Frozen in buildings that could not keep them warm. Lost in the snow, trying to reach help that never came. Crushed when roofs collapsed under the weight of the drifts. The survivors did not speak of the dead. Not at first. The wounds were too fresh, the grief too overwhelming. But as the days passed, the silence began to break. People started to share their stories, where they had been when the storm hit, what they had done to survive, how they had made it through when so many others had not. The children began to play. It was a cramped kind of play, constrained by the small space and the presence of so many adults. But it was play, nonetheless. Games of imagination that turned the dugout into a castle, a ship, a secret cave where treasures were hidden. The sound of their laughter was the most beautiful thing Cena had ever heard. The adults began to help. They took over tasks that Cena had been doing alone. They helped with the cooking. They helped with the fire. They helped keep the space clean and organized. And slowly something changed. The people who had mocked her began to respect her. The people who had called her a vagrant began to see her as a savior. The people who had watched her walk away with nothing began to understand what it meant to have nothing and build everything from scratch. On the third night, Alderman Whitmore approached her. The others were sleeping or trying to sleep, their bodies packed together for warmth. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, casting a dim red glow across the crowded space. Whitmore sat down beside her in the corner she had claimed as her own. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke. "I owe you an apology." His voice was low-pitched so that only she could hear. "Not just for what I said when you left, for all of it, for the searches, for the bounty hunters, for everything I did to try to find you and drive you out." Cena looked at him. In the dim light, his face looked older than she remembered. The lines were deeper. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you hate me so much?" Whitmore was silent for a long moment. "Because you defied me," he said finally. "Because you survived when I said you would die. Because every morning when I saw that smoke rising from the hillside, I knew that I was wrong and you were right." He paused. "I am not a man who likes being wrong." Cena almost smiled. "No," she said. "I noticed that. I spent months trying to prove that you were dead, that the smoke was natural, that my certainty was justified." He shook his head. "But every morning the smoke kept rising. And every morning I knew that somewhere out there a 17-year-old girl was making a fool of me." Cena looked at him, at this man who had been her enemy for so long. She felt many things. Anger, yes. The anger had not disappeared just because she had chosen to help. The wounds he had inflicted were still raw, still painful. But she also felt something else. Something that surprised her: pity. This man had spent his entire life believing that power was all that mattered. That those who had it deserved to keep it. That those who did not have it deserved their suffering. And now he had learned in the most brutal way possible that power meant nothing against the forces of nature. That all his money and all his influence could not keep him warm when the temperature dropped to 50 below. He had lost everything. Not his possessions. Those could be rebuilt. But his certainty, his belief in his own superiority, his conviction that the world operated according to rules he understood and controlled, that was gone. And in its place was something fragile, something uncertain, something that might, with time and effort, grow into wisdom. "Why did you save us?" Whitmore asked. He seemed genuinely confused. "After everything I did, why?" Sina considered the question. She thought about all the answers she could give, the noble answers about forgiveness and mercy, the practical answers about survival and community, the angry answers about proving him wrong. In the end, she told him the truth, because my father taught me that the measure of a person is not how they treat those who treat them well, she said. It is how they treat those who treat them poorly. She paused. "You treated me poorly, but I do not have to become like you. I do not have to let your cruelty turn me into something less than I want to be." Whitmore bowed his head. "I do not deserve your mercy," he said. "No," Sine agreed. "You do not." She stood looking down at him. "But that is what mercy means. It is given to those who do not deserve it. Otherwise, it would just be justice." She walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Behind her, she heard a sound she had never expected to hear. Alderman Cornelius Whitmore was crying. The 2 weeks in the dugout changed everyone who lived through them. They learned what it meant to be cold and then warm. They learned what it meant to be desperate and then saved. They learned what it meant to mock someone's preparations and then need those preparations to survive. They learned about each other. The blacksmith who had seemed so gruff and unfriendly turned out to have a gift for storytelling. He kept the children entertained for hours with tales of giants and trolls and magical forests. The school teacher, who had always seemed so proper and reserved, revealed a talent for making people laugh. Her observations about the absurdities of their situation kept spirits high when they might have sunk into despair. The farmers, who had worked their separate claims and rarely spoken to each other, discovered that they had more in common than they had realized. They made plans for the future, for how they would rebuild, for how they would help each other when the snow finally melted. And they learned about Sina. They learned that she had built this dugout with her own hands, cutting earth and hauling timber and working from dawn to dusk for 3 months. They learned that she had survived the winter alone, hunting and trapping and preserving food with skills that none of them possessed. They learned that she was 17 years old. Just a girl, really. A girl who had been cast out with nothing and had refused to die. On the 10th day, the little girl that Whitmore had been carrying woke up. Her name was Emma. She was 6 years old. Her parents had died in the storm, frozen when their soddy collapsed under the weight of the snow. Whitmore had found her wandering in the ruins alone and crying, and had carried her the entire 5 miles to the hillside. When she woke, she did not cry. She looked around the crowded dugout with wide, serious eyes. Then she walked over to Sina, who was preparing the morning meal. "Are you an angel?" she asked. Sina smiled. "No," she said. "I am just a person." "My mama said angels live underground," Emma said. "She said they watch over us and keep us safe." Sina knelt down so that she was at eye level with the child. "Your mama was very wise," she said. "But I am not an angel. I am just a girl who built a home where no one could find it." Emma considered this. "Can I stay with you?" she asked. "I do not have a mama anymore." Sina felt her heart break. She looked at this child, this orphan of the storm, and saw herself. 6 years old, motherless, with only her father to guide her through the world. Now she had neither. "You can stay as long as you need," Sina said. "We will figure out the rest later." Emma nodded, satisfied. Then she sat down beside Sina and watched her work, asking questions about everything she did. "Why do you cut the meat that way? What are those herbs for? How did you learn to do that?" Sina answered every question. And somewhere in her heart, a door that she had not known was closed began to open. On the 14th day, they heard the sound of horses. Sina was the first to notice. She had spent months listening for the approach of enemies, and her ears were attuned to sounds that others would miss. She went to the entrance of the dugout and opened the door. A wagon train was approaching from the east. 5 wagons, each pulled by a team of horses. Riders flanked them on either side. The American flag flew from the lead wagon. The relief parties had finally arrived. Signe turned back to the people in her dugout. "Help is here," she said. The reaction was immediate. People surged toward the entrance, desperate to see, to confirm, to believe. They crowded around the Cena, looking out at the approaching wagons with tears streaming down their faces. They were saved. They had survived. It was over. The wagon train took nearly an hour to reach the base of the hillside. The snow was deep and even the horses struggled to make progress. When they finally arrived, a man jumped down from the lead wagon and approached the group of survivors. He was tall, with blonde hair and a beard that was still young and sparse with brown. He wore the clothes of a workman, heavy canvas and leather designed for labor rather than appearance. His name was Halvor Strand. He was a carpenter from Minnesota sent west with the relief effort to help rebuild what the storm had destroyed. And when he saw Sina Lindahl standing at the entrance of her dugout, surrounded by the people she had saved, he stopped walking. He stood in the snow, staring at her as if seeing something he had never expected to find, something that would change his life forever. Later, much later, he would tell her what he had thought in that moment. He would tell her that he had seen an angel. Not the kind with wings and halos, but the real kind. The kind that lives in the world and does the work that needs to be done. The kind that saves lives and asks for nothing in return. He would tell her that he had fallen in love with her before he even knew her name. But that was later. In that moment, he simply walked forward and extended his hand. "I am Halvor Strand," he said. "We have come to help." Sina took his hand. "I am Sina Lindahl," she said, "and these are the survivors of Havenwood." She paused, looking at the wagons, at the supplies, at the promise of a future that she had not dared to imagine. "We are glad you are here." The days that followed were a blur of activity. The relief workers set up camp at the base of the hillside, establishing a temporary shelter for the survivors while they assessed the damage in Havenwood. The news was grim: 17 dead in the town itself, dozens more on the farms and homesteads scattered across the territory. Entire families wiped out, entire communities destroyed. The storm of 1887 would be remembered as one of the worst in Dakota history. But amid the devastation, one story stood out: the story of the smoke from nowhere. The journalist who had come with the relief wagons listened in amazement as the survivors told their tale. The girl who had been cast out, the dugout she had built with her own hands, the smoke that had risen every morning defying all attempts to find its source, and the 23 lives she had saved when the storm came. They wrote it down, these journalists. They would carry it back east, publish it in papers from New York to San Francisco. The girl in the ground, the smoke from nowhere, the miracle on the hillside. It would become one of the most famous stories of the frontier. But before the journalists could finish their work, before the survivors could be transported to safety, one more thing needed to happen. Alderman Cornelius Whitmore asked to speak. They gathered in a clearing at the base of the hillside, the survivors and the relief workers and the journalists with their notebooks. The sun was shining for the first time in weeks, its light reflecting off the snow with a brilliance that made everyone squint. Whitmore stood before them. He looked older than he had before the storm. The lines on his face had deepened. His shoulders, once straight with pride, were bowed, but his voice when he spoke was steady. "I owe this young woman my life," he said. He gestured towards Sina, who stood at the edge of the crowd with little Emma holding her hand. "I owe her an apology that I can never fully make." He paused, gathering himself. "When she was cast out of her home, I did nothing to help. When she walked away with nothing, I mocked her. I called her a vagrant. I said she was living like an animal. I said no decent person hides like this." His voice broke. "I led search parties to find her and drive her out. I hired bounty hunters to track her down. I declared her dead when I could not find her." He looked at Sina, and there were tears in his eyes. "And when the storm came, when I was dying, when everyone I knew was dying, she took me in anyway. She fed me. She warmed me. She saved my life." He fell to his knees in the snow. "I was wrong about everything. Wrong about her. Wrong about what survival looks like. Wrong about what decency means." He bowed his head. "She is the most decent person I have ever met, and I have been the worst kind of fool." Sina looked at him, this man who had been her enemy, now humbled before the world. She felt many things, but most of all she felt free. The hatred that had sustained her through the long months of winter, the anger that had driven her to survive, to prove them all wrong, it was gone. In its place was something else, something lighter, something that felt like peace. She walked forward, pulling Emma along with her, and stood before Whitmore. "Get up," she said. Her voice was not harsh, it was simply matter of fact. Whitmore looked up at her, confusion on his face. Get up, she repeated. You have apologized. I have heard you. Now get up. Slowly, Whitmore rose to his feet. Sina looked at him, at the crowd around them, at the journalists scribbling in their notebooks. I did not build that dugout because I wanted to prove anyone wrong, she said. I built it because I had nowhere else to go. I learned from my father and from old Niels how to work with the earth instead of against it. I learned that the old ways sometimes know things that the new way have forgotten. She paused. You can laugh at someone's preparations. You can call them crazy. Call them animals. Call them whatever makes you feel superior. But when the storm comes, and the storm always comes, the ones who prepared are the ones who survive. She looked at Whitmore. And if they are good people, she said, they will save you too. The crowd was silent. Then Halvor Strand began to clap. One pair of hands, then another, until the entire gathering was applauding, the sound rising into the clear winter air like a celebration of everything they had survived. Sina stood in the center of it, still holding Emma's hand, and allowed herself to smile. 3 days later, the survivors were transported to a temporary camp established by the relief effort. Before she left, Sina received a visitor, a lawyer from the territorial government sent to resolve the question of land ownership in the wake of the disaster. He had news. The 30 acres on the hillside, the land where Sina had built her dugout, had never been properly claimed. Her father had intended to file on it, but had died before he could. Now, in recognition of what she had done, the territorial government was granting her full ownership. It is yours, the lawyer said. Free and clear. No one can take it from you. Sina took the document he handed her. She stared at it for a long moment. This piece of paper represented everything she had fought for. The home she had built, the life she had earned, the future she had created for herself when everyone else had abandoned her. It was hers. Thank you, she said. The lawyer nodded and left. Sina sat alone in her dugout, holding the deed to her land, and allowed herself to weep. Not from sadness, from joy, from relief, from the simple, overwhelming knowledge that she had won. The spring of 1888 brought grief. Old Niels Bergman died in April. He passed peacefully in his sleep in the dugout he had built 30 years before, in the home that had taught him how to survive when everyone else perished. Sina was with him at the end. She had visited him regularly throughout the year, bringing food and company and news of the outside world. She had told him about the storm, about the people she had saved, about the recognition she had received. He had listened with a smile on his weathered face. You did well, he had said. Your father would be proud. Now he lay still, his eyes closed, his face relaxed in a peace that he had rarely shown in life. Sina sat beside him for a long time. She thought about everything he had taught her, the skills that had saved her life, the wisdom that had guided her choices, the courage that had inspired her when she wanted to give up. He had taken his pain and turned it into knowledge. He had taken his grief and turned it into purpose. He had spent 30 years preparing for a storm that might never come, and when it finally came, his preparations had saved 23 lives. Not his life, but others. Sina hoped that wherever he was now, he was at peace. They buried him on the hillside where Sina's dugout stood. The headstone was simple. Old Niels Bergman, it read. He taught us how to disappear. We learned how to survive. It was, Sina thought, exactly what he would have wanted. 5 years passed. The territory changed. The railroads came. Towns grew and prospered. The frontier that had once seemed so wild and dangerous became tame, civilized, connected to the wider world. Havenwood was rebuilt. Not in the same place, but nearby. The new town was larger than the old, with proper buildings made of wood and brick, with streets that were planned and maintained, with all the amenities of modern civilization. Alderman Whitmore did not return. He had resigned his position, sold his interests, and moved away. Some said he had gone east to live with relatives. Others said he had found religion in seeking penance for his sins. Whatever the truth, he was gone. But he wrote to Sina every year on the anniversary of the storm. Short letters filled with gratitude and shame and the ongoing struggle to become a better man. She always wrote back, not because she had forgiven him. Forgiveness was too simple a word for what had passed between them, but because she understood that his journey was not yet over and that he needed to know that someone was watching, someone who believed he could change. Sina herself had changed. She married Halvor Strand in the summer of 1889. They built a house on the hillside next to the dugout that had saved so many lives. The dugout remained preserved and maintained a shelter that the community knew they could rely on if another storm ever came. They had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. All of them learned the old ways. They learned how to read the weather, how to work with the land, how to prepare for storms that might never come. They learned the skills that their mother had learned from her father and from old Nils. They learned what it meant to survive. Little Emma stayed with them. The orphan of the storm became part of their family, a daughter in all but blood. She grew up strong and capable and kind, a reflection of the woman who had saved her. She called Sina mother, and Sina loved her as her own. The phrase smoke from nowhere entered the vocabulary of the Dakota settlers. It came to mean any preparation that looks like madness until you need it. When someone was mocked for their caution, for their stockpiles, for their underground shelters, the old-timers would shake their heads and say, "Remember the smoke from nowhere. Remember Sina Lindahl." And the mockers would fall silent. Because everyone knew the story. Everyone knew what had happened to the people who laughed at the smoke. And everyone knew what had happened to the girl who had kept the fire burning. On the 10th anniversary of the storm, Sina stood at the entrance of her dugout. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and gold. Her children played in the yard nearby. Halvor was inside preparing the evening meal. She could hear their voices, the sounds of the life she had built. It was not the life she had imagined when she was 17, cast out with nothing, walking into an uncertain future. It was better. She had been tested by the worst that the world could throw at her. She had been abandoned by everyone she knew. She had been declared dead by the most powerful man in the territory. And she had survived. Not just survived, she had triumphed. She had built a home, a family, a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. She had proved that the measure of a person is not the circumstances they face, but the choices they make. And she had made the right choices. She looked at the hillside, at the spot where the smoke had risen every morning for 5 months. It still rose sometimes. On cold mornings when Halvor built up the fire in the old stove, the thin gray thread would climb into the sky, a reminder of everything that had happened. The smoke from nowhere. Still rising, still defying the world's expectations, still keeping the fire burning. Sina smiled. Then she turned and walked back to her family, back to the life she had earned, back to the future that stretched out before her like the prairie itself. Endless, beautiful, hers.